Dr. Hamilton. Oh, Dr. Hamilton is a dance and costume historian and curator specializing in the evolution and construction of early 20th century ballet costume. In 2018, Carolyn led a project to catalog and rehouse the Jacob's Pillow Historic Costume Collection and has continued to work with the collection as costume curator since 2021. She holds an MA in World History and Cultures from King's College London and a PhD from the University of Brighton in collaboration with Royal Pavilion and Museums Trust. Her doctoral thesis examined the design and impact of Balanchine's short-lived ballet company, Le Ballets Russes 1933, through the surviving costume and material culture. In 2022, Carolyn Hamilton was approached by former Tobin Theatre Collection of Theatre Arts Scott Blackshire to offer a new perspective to the collection's extensive Ballet Russe holdings. As a result, Dr. Hamilton is the guest curator for the exhibition Women Artists of the Ballet Russe, Designing the Legacy, currently open at the McNay Art Museum and closing on the 12th of January. The exhibition highlights some of the extraordinary women involved in the company, including designers, artists, dancers, costume makers, and financial patrons. I'm delighted to have Dr. Hamilton with us today, as we have conversed before over mutual interest in historic ballet costumes, and I know her to have a wealth of knowledge. I'm excited to see the final product of Carolyn's work with a museum and materials that are both close to my heart. So Carolyn, please take it away.
Technical issues. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. All right, let me try and share all these technical things. Okay, where's it gone? Give me one moment. All right, I think that should be you seeing the slideshow, Chloe. Okay, I think I've got it. Great. So thank you so much for having me today. So today I'm going to be talking about the exhibition that Chloe mentioned, Women Artists of the Ballet Russe, Designing the Legacy, which closes this coming Sunday at the McNay Art Museum in San Antonio. There is now a YouTube walkthrough. I think Chloe's going to drop that link in the chat, so you can all have a look at that if you get a chance. I am a little bit awkward on camera, so please be kind to me, but you will get an idea of what the exhibition looks like. So today, rather than focus solely sort of on the content of the exhibition, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the process and the behind the scenes of the curation, and in particular, the costume mounting, and also how it worked with me as a guest curator on this collection. So as Chloe mentioned, I am a dance historian specializing in early 20th century ballet and modern dance costume. So these are incredible objects. And from this period in the early 20th century, they're often the only tangible thing to survive from these performances, and they can provide so much information. These garments were integral to the performances. So a lot of my research and work has been into how we should view these costume items as a primary source, not just an illustrative one, that they contain just as much information as other more traditional primary sources in historical research, and often things that are no longer available from any other source. So here are just some little examples from my work in other collections. And these things might all seem quite minor, but they do build up to create a much bigger and fuller picture of these companies. So in the top corner, you can see here a little bit of bloom body makeup on a unitard. And discovering this confirmed a theory that the dancers had worn body makeup, but there was no proof. There was no photographs, there was no accounts. But here we have the actual evidence on it there. The bottom image there will be familiar to some of the names I've seen here. And this is a pair of trousers worn by Ted Shawn's men dancers. And they were very, very tight, these amazing high-waisted bell bottoms. And they talked about how tight they were and how difficult they were to dance in. And here you can see that confirmed in the amount of times that they ripped the crutch, there is many, many patches on these trousers, which again add that story. And this last one, I just find really fascinating because this detail that you see here, this orange and this purple, would only have been seen by the dancer. You wouldn't have been able to see this on stage. It isn't even in the design. This is something purely that the costume maker added herself. And I think that kind of detail is quite interesting. But these costumes, dance costumes in general, they're not designed to survive. They're not designed to go into a museum or an archive at some point. They're designed to be worn. And they're often worn until they quite literally fall apart or are too old or too dated. And then often they end up being stored. And sometimes they end up in collections, but often in places that are not necessarily set up or designed for this kind of material culture. They've often ended up in libraries, art galleries, or archives. Dance costumes kind of fall through this interesting gap. They're not pristine like fashion, a Dior gown. These were working garments. These wear marks, the repair marks, they're all important information, but it makes them difficult objects to use and display in a conventional sense. Conservation is very expensive. Displaying them is difficult. These items were made for specific bodies. They often can't fit on standard mannequins. These trousers I'm showing you here, I think those ones maybe are a 21-inch waist. These were very slim gentlemen. So it's quite difficult to utilize these pieces. And it means that they often stay in storage as a result. And the costumes for the Ballets Russes, for Diaghilev's Ballets Russes, are a prime example of this. They were split and divided in a series of auctions in the late 1960s, and they've quite literally ended up all over the world. So it's sort of become both a professional and personal mission of mine to kind of track down as many of these collections as possible and examine these pieces. And this is what led me to the Robert Tobin collection at the McNay. So Robert Tobin was a rather eccentric and extravagant collector in the 50s and 60s. He was a huge theatre fan, so he collected a lot of theatre arts. But he also had a soft spot for ballet, and he built up a very large collection of designs and about 10 costumes. And here you can see him posed with some of the costumes he purchased. And yes, he is sitting on one of the costumes. And he used to wear some of the costumes to parties, which is actually not as uncommon as you might think. I have quite a lot of accounts of people wearing these pieces in the 60s and 70s. I do not advise that now. Please don't wear things from the collection. But when I found out about this collection, that's what brought me to San Antonio. So in 2020, right before the world shut down, I was working on a fellowship at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin. And I went over to San Antonio to see these pieces. And I met with the former curator of the Theatre Arts Collection, Scott Blackshire. And we had a wonderful afternoon looking at the pieces. And it was really interesting because, as I said, often these pieces end up in much bigger collections of perhaps more traditional artwork or ephemera. And they're often just a small section. So Scott's specialty was not in these costumes at all. So we had this really interesting, conversation where we were sort of able to bring together our two sides of this knowledge. And I could show him a lot of these primary sources that I work with in these pieces. So we stayed in touch. And a number of years later, I think it was about 2022, I was approached again by Scott and former assistant curator Kim, and they wanted me to reframe the Ballets Russes holdings. They were looking for a new way to approach the collection, something that would bring it to be more relevant for a modern audience, and just a different way of approaching these pieces. So these two images I show you here are two of the most famous images they have in the collection, and these are pieces that they showed quite often. We ended up not showing these in the exhibition, but this really sort of summarizes the version of the Ballets Russes that the McNay had shown. The Ballets Russes collection is really a jewel in the theatre arts collection there, but it had been really shown with the sort of pre-war pieces at the front. So these beautiful designs by Leon Bergst, a lot of the narrative around Diaghilev as the impresario, and Václav Nijinsky as the premier dancer. So I came up with two main themes that I thought would really work as a way to reframe this collection. The first was women, the women of the Ballets Russes. Now, you might think that women and ballet pretty much go together. In fact, ballet is sort of synonymous with the idea of women. But it has been, and it continues to be, a very male-dominated industry, particularly in terms of directors, choreographers, composers, and designers. This isn't to say that women have not been there, but they have often been overlooked or forgotten in the pages of history. So this is something I really wanted to address. So the company only had one female choreographer across its 20 years, and that was Bronislava Nijinská. And they also only employed 4 female designers. There was also a host of other women that have been forgotten or excluded, including financial patrons, corps de ballet dancers, other artists and photographers who captured the company, as well as the wig makers, shoemakers, and costume makers who realized these incredible designs. So I approached Scott and Kim with this idea, and this is what they sent me back. This is the slide from, I think, 2022. And these were the 4 women that they felt would best portray items from the collection and portray the story that they wanted to tell. So that included Bronislava Nijinská, who I've already mentioned, who began her work with the company as a dancer, and then she returned in the early 20s as a choreographer. And that's where she really started creating very modern, very avant-garde works. The next focus was Natalia Goncharova, who's an incredible Russian artist who designed for the company from 1914. And the McNay has quite a large amount of her work. Then we have Sonia Delaunay, who redesigned one of the ballets in 1918. And finally, Alexandra Exter. And Exter is quite an interesting addition because she actually didn't work directly for the Ballets Russes. And I apologize if you could hear my dog barking. He's a bit needy in the background. Alexandra Exter did not work directly for the Ballets Russes, but she did collaborate with Nijinská in the 1920s. She was also a Russian emigre. So they all came from this same sort of world, and they all worked with each other in different ways. So it was decided that this would be the focus of the main gallery. So the main gallery would sort of be chronological of the Diaghilev era Ballets Russes, so 1909 to 1929, and would look at those 2 decades through the eyes of these women, as well as other women involved in the company that helped bring these pieces to life. The second gallery, and I will show some images of the layout later so you can sort of see what I mean, was going to explore more the legacy of these women, because that seemed, again, a really important thread, not only the legacy of the company itself in terms of ballet in the US, but also these women, and in particular, Bronislava Nijinská, who would emigrate to the US in the late 1930s, and then would become a very important teacher, teaching the first real wave of American-born dancers, including the first American prima ballerina, Maria Tolchief, who was also the first Native American ballerina. So we had this great focus of these women, but I also had a second theme that I was really keen to portray in this exhibition, and that was the collection itself. So I wanted to situate this Ballets Russes collection at the McNay within the global Ballets Russes holdings, and to show how they all work together, how they were all pieces of the same puzzle, because so many of these collections are now seen in isolation. So just for an example, this ballet Sadko, which is absolutely wonderful underwater ballet from 1916. It was designed by Natalia Goncharova. It was actually performed in the US in 1916 and early 1917. It only lasted in the repertoire a couple of years and then was dropped, but you can see these costumes are just fabulous. So the costumes and designs for this one ballet are now spread across 9 different collections that I've identified so far. There are still pieces not identified across 5 different countries, and you can see the list of them here. And in most cases, pieces have been completely split. So you can see here these wonderful seahorse costumes. There were 4. One of them is now in Stockholm. One of them is now in Canberra. The other 2 I have yet to trace. So if you know any collections with a seahorse, please let me know. But I thought this was a really interesting opportunity to be able to potentially reunite some pieces. So here is an example of 2 pieces that we were able to reunite. So this is the costume for one of the 4 royal pages in The Sleeping Princess, which was the Ballets Russes version of Sleeping Beauty. And the design is held at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hertford, and this one of the costumes is held at the McNay. So we were able to loan the design and bring these 2 pieces back together. And a little side note, this costume was actually worn by a young dancer called Patrick Kay, who later went on to become Anton Dolan, who was a very famous dancer across the middle of the 20th century and was one of the founding members of ballet theatre, now American Ballet Theatre. So again, that idea of legacy, I thought was still coming through even when this piece was worn by a male dancer. So we ended up being able to loan, we drew hugely from the McNay's own collection, but we also were able to loan from 6 different institutions, 5 within the USA and 1 overseas. So this included the Harry Ransom Center, the Ballets Russes Special Collections at the University of Oklahoma, the Wadsworth Athenaeum, Jacob's Pillow Archive, the Library of Congress, and then coming all the way from Stockholm, the Dance Museum. So this was a really exciting opportunity to be able to bring pieces also from some collections that hadn't loaned that much before. So to bring these pieces all together was really, really interesting. So now I'm going to talk through a couple of the pieces in detail and my sort of research process. So this is one of the first costumes that really was a starting point for me in the curation of this exhibition. So I should say that as guest curator, I wrote all the texts that you see in the exhibition, and I was also responsible for the loaned costumes. As a costume curator, I'm a little closer to a dress and fashion curator in that I am very hands-on with the objects. These pieces are very unique. How to mount them, how to handle them is a really specialized skill. So I worked with all the loan costumes, which was really exciting to be able to bring these pieces together. So this first costume is an absolutely beautiful piece from the ballet Firebird. So this kind of started off a lot of the conversation actually with Scott and Kim at the McNay. So Chloe, who introduced us, actually had been working on this piece at the Ballets Russes Special Collection at the University of Oklahoma, and had sent some images of it to Scott and Kim at the McNay, and they had then sent them to me. So all that was known was that it was from the Firebird, and they suspected it was probably from the 1910 original production of Firebird. And I was very excited to see this, one of my favorite ballets, so I'm always keen to work on pieces from this ballet. So the first thing I wanted to know when trying to identify this piece was, were there any names inside? Any names, any stamps, any labels? For any of you that have danced, have children that dance, or have been up close to dance costumes, the information is all inside. Often there's layers of names inside. But what was interesting with this piece was that there were no names, nothing in any of the pieces. So that's what made me think that it might be actually a solo character or a principal character, because when there's just one of a costume, often there is not a name in that because you knew which costume you needed to grab. The names are more likely to be in costumes where there are multiples of them. So there were no names, and perhaps more importantly, there was no stamp. So in every costume piece produced by the Ballets Russes I think it's about 1912, might be 1911, there is a German custom stamp in them. And this shows you immediately that that piece dates from pre-1912. And this was whenever they crossed the border, all the pieces had to be accounted for. And there was no stamps in any of these pieces. So I was pretty sure that this was not from the 1910 version of Firebird. That didn't mean it wasn't from Firebird. They quite often would remount ballets. So that led me to the second version of Firebird, which was created in 1926 and was designed by Natalia Goncharova. So I tracked down some pieces from that ballet, and here you can see one of the princess's costumes at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and an attendant costume at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. And you can immediately see a lot of similarities to the costume from Oklahoma. So my first thought was it was one of these princess costumes, but it still had a number of details that this one didn't have. There's a gold border, there's just more detail in it. So I still wasn't quite sure. So my next port of call was I knew that a lot of the later Ballet Russe works were reused by the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, which was a company that sprang up in the 1930s, and they bought a lot of the costumes. And this company toured quite extensively, including to Australia. And there is a fantastic online resource called Trove in Australia, which draws together a number of collections, including the National Library of Australia. So I managed to find these two images on that collection. And here you can see very clearly the headdress, and you can see the costume being worn with the jacket, with the headdress. So this gave me the proof that this costume was for the beautiful princess. So she's the lead of the group of princesses in the Firebird. So that was super exciting, but I still didn't know or couldn't confirm that this costume had been worn in the 20s. It made sense, it matched the other ones, but it was still possible that they had made a new costume in the 30s. But then I found this photograph from 1926 of Lyubov Chernysheva as the princess in the Firebird, definitely wearing this headdress, definitely wearing the tunic and the jacket. So I finally had the final piece of the puzzle, which was really exciting. And one of the things I loved about this too is that the woman you just saw wearing it in the 1930s, that is actually this dancer's daughter-in-law. So I loved that sort of idea that the costume had been passed down to her. I was also able to research who had made the costumes for Firebird in 1926. And the making was overseen by Vera Sudikina. So again, I had another name, another woman. So many of the costume makers are not recorded. But their skill, I think, was really important, so significant, because no one had made costumes like this before. You know, these incredible artists were designing these amazing costumes, like the seahorse you just saw. But the person that actually realized those in fabric into something that is both wearable and danceable, I think absolutely deserves credit. So anywhere we could in the exhibition, and in further work I do, I try and make sure we know not only the designer, the composer, the choreographer, but who made it and who wore it. So I was able to go and see the costume in April, and here are some of my measurements from that, and here are some of my sketches of how we envisaged displaying it. Originally, we had hoped to maybe have the attendant come from Hartford as well, but that ended up not being possible. And I think it was kind of nice to actually have her on her own, have her moment. I was also slightly pleased because mounting costumes with pants is really hard, especially these very, very slim ballet boys. It's very tricky. So here is mounting of that costume and then finally in place. And you can see next to it, we had a blow up of the photograph from Australia showing the costume on stage. So I was really pleased with how that came out. This was the first time that the headdress and tunic had all been displayed together. The headdress was very front heavy. That's the problem with headdresses and mannequins is you no longer have hair to pin it into. So that was quite tricky. We ended up making a little ethafoam block to sit behind it so that it had something to rest into. So one of the reasons I mentioned earlier that costumes are often not displayed is it's tricky to display them. And it's hard to display something that was meant to be seen in movement, suddenly static in an interesting way. So I'm always trying to explore ways that we can show dance costumes in a way that's different, that will give a different side to what these pieces are. So when you come into the exhibition, the first two costumes you see are these two beautiful costumes from Narcisse. Narcisse was a ballet from 1911, designed by Bakst. It's a very classic Ballets Russes piece, very beautiful. And that was the idea, that you would come in and you would see what you think of when you hear the word Ballets Russes. You would see some of the beautiful Bakst designs, and then as you moved around the exhibition, you would start to see some of the more avant-garde works, some of the different side to the company that is often not shown. But we wanted to begin with these, and I really wanted to show these two costumes in particular. These costumes come from the Harry Ransom Center, and in 2017 they had displayed one of these costumes in this absolutely brilliant way. They had created a mannequin out of material called Fosse-shape, and they had created it so that the back of the costume could be displayed open, and that you could see inside and you could see the labels and the custom stamp. So as soon as we were sort of given the go-ahead that we were able to loan, I reached out to the Harry Ransom Center and to Eric, who's absolutely fantastic there, hoping we could both loan the costumes, but could we loan this mannequin as well? Did they still have it? Could we loan it? And the answer was yes. So we were able to, only the yellow costume has that special mounting. The blue costume is more traditional. The idea is you see them from the front, and then you can actually walk around and you can see into the back. And this is what you see. So there's the German custom stamp that I mentioned at the top. And then there is these labels from the costume maker in the middle. So these costumes were made in St. Petersburg, and they were pretty much sort of mail order at this time. So this costume maker had a very specific way of recording the ballet, the character, and the dancer in each costume, and you can see them on these cotton tapes. And in some cases, he actually even writes the design number so that they could cross-check what they had. So these all came from the atelier of Ivan Kaffy in St. Petersburg. He made a number of the costumes pre-World War I. He had worked for the Imperial Theatres, and then he had his own atelier. So that was a really interesting and exciting way that we could show these costumes in a different way. So then the final sort of close-up I'm going to show you is another example of being able to reunite some pieces. So this was very exciting. So quite early on, when we were going through our sort of dream checklist of external loans, but also what the McNay had themselves, this backdrop came up. And this is in the collection at the McNay. And I was so glad that Scott decided that yes, he wanted it, he thinks we can do it, because I had actually never ever worked in an exhibition where we could show a full backdrop, because they're enormous. They're difficult to display, they're just absolutely enormous. But because this one is a tent, so it is just the centerpiece you see there, it gave us a few more possibilities. So it was decided that this would be the main focus of the second gallery, the gallery that explored the legacy of the company. So this ballet, The Golden Cockerel, was first created in 1914, and then it was completely revived in 1937 with new set, new costumes, pretty much new everything. And that is what this comes from. And it was, so it's the tent of the Queen of Shamakhan, and it rose up from the stage, sort of a Nutcracker Christmas tree style. It rose up. You can see that in the photograph behind. So I was so excited that we were going to be able to show this, but we can't show the Queen's tent without the Queen. So that is when I began researching this incredible costume. So this is the Queen's costume, the Queen of Shamakhan, and it is an absolutely stunning costume. She just wears this when she comes out of the tent and then takes it off to dance. You can see in the photograph the attendants holding, that's what they're holding behind her. And it is really beautiful. So this is held at the Dance Museum in Stockholm, and we were really lucky that they agreed to loan it to us. So this flew to San Antonio in a fabulous padded crate, and we were really excited to be able to reunite them. So here is some details of this costume. I have worked with a lot of Ballets Russes costumes and other companies, and I do think this is one of the most beautifully made costumes I have ever worked on. It was just stunning. So this was made by Barbara Korinska, who was a fascinating costume maker and designer. She went on to move to the US and became a primary costume maker for New York City Ballet, and collaborated with George Balanchine on dozens of ballets. She even went on to win an Oscar for her costume design. but this is one of her earlier works. And the way she was able to replicate Goncharva's design in fabric is just incredible. You can see I'm very nerdy about this, sorry. But, the way she's layered, leather and lace, it's so unusual. So I just had to show you some of the close-ups because it was such a joy to see this. So as I said, this costume came from Stockholm. So this was a virtual courier. So this was unboxed and mounted on Zoom, which is always a bit of a challenge, but the wonders of modern technology. And then we were able to reunite them. So this is, again, a little sketch of my initial hope. So we had hoped to be able to loan 2 of her attendants as well to flank the Queen. But budgets are always tight, as I'm sure we all know. So that did not happen. But instead, she got her sort of solo moment. And it's a little hard to see. There's more height in the actual room. And I didn't get a good photo that really shows the height of it. But yes, it was really wonderful to bring these 2 pieces back together the first time since the last performance of this ballet. And also, most of the members of the museum had never seen this backdrop because it can't be displayed very often. It can't even be, unrolled for a viewing because it's very large. All right. So in the last sort of 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a little bit of a walkthrough of the exhibition and show you how these pieces that I've highlighted sort of fitted together. So as I said, when you come in, you're sort of greeted by the first section, which is the kind of classic pre-war ballet russe, the kind of idea that a lot of people have in mind, the beautiful Bakst ballets. And that's where these 2 costumes from Narcisse were, and then the big introduction panels. So everything at the McNay Museum is in Spanish and English. So that's why it's quite label heavy. But I think that's great. It makes it a lot more inclusive for a lot of the community in that area. So there was also a number of cases. I don't have so many good pictures of those, but we had a lot of ephemera as well. I was quite keen to bring in a lot of things that might not normally be seen in an art museum. So there's quite a range from beautiful works on paper to photographs to the costumes to programs to notebooks, etc., because they all are equally as important in this story. So as you turn the corner, then you get really the beginning of the sort of avant-garde ballet russe. So this is a wonderful costume for the King of the Sea from the Ballet Sadko, which I showed you earlier with the seahorse. And this costume is in the McNay's collection. So it was really great to be able to show this and just show how colorful and vibrant. I mean, it's important if you're not familiar with the ballet russe, sort of forget everything you think you know about ballet. There was not a tutu in sight in this company. It was all very much about the art and the story with these. And then as you moved around the corner, this was where we had the small section on Sonia Delaunay. It ended up being smaller than we had hoped. It would have been wonderful to have some of the costume pieces too, but that was not possible. But still, we were able to include some designs and some reproduction photographs. And then moving around, this begins the 1920s section and begins with The Sleeping Princess, which was, as I mentioned earlier, the ballet that brought Nijinsky back to the company. She choreographed some pieces for it. She was also a dancer in it. So this was a huge production revival of the Sleeping Beauty ballet with hundreds of costumes, no expense spared. It pretty much bankrupted the company. So here you see 3 of the costumes. Although these are all men's costumes, they were all made by women. And different levels of, there's 2 of them are made by a wonderful atelier in Paris, and then one made by in London, sort of copying, trying to emulate the seamstress in Paris. So that's quite interesting, those sort of layers of information. We were also able to reunite some of the costumes with their designs, which you can just see behind. Also I want to point out in the case in the bottom corner with the pink writing, that is Nijinsky's notebook with her choreographic notes for The Sleeping Princess. So that was really exciting to be able to loan that from the Library of Congress. And a lot of people found that really interesting in the exhibition. Because again, that's a side you don't normally get to see, the notation and the notes of how they're actually creating these pieces. And then the final wall of the first room goes through the 1920s, looking at Nijinsky's solo, her sort of more avant-garde works. So Les Noces, Les Biches, Le Trembleur, which she created for the Ballets Russes, and then finally ends with her collaboration with Exter. So after she left the Ballets Russes, she created her own company, and Alexandra Exter designed the costumes for this company. And here are some of the designs, and they're just wonderful. They're very modern, and they're really fun to look at. And then the final section on the other side of that barrier when you came in is the Firebird. So she was the last moment in the main gallery. And we had her looking out to where you would then walk as a member of the public. So when you turn around, I don't have a picture with it all installed, but you basically walk down this corridor where we had video playing, music throughout the galleries, and then you look across this atrium, this stairwell, and there was the tent with the Queen in front. So we had this moment with the princess and the Queen sort of looking at one another, which was a really nice kind of connection to be able to do. So then this section is the library part of the Tobin wing. And this is where we had the legacy section. So this idea of the impact and influence of these women and the company on ballet in the US. So the center was obviously the beautiful set piece and the Queen's costume. And then down either side of this room, there are these cases, very, very big cases. So we filled 4 of them on each side, and then at the end was a video monitor. So on one side, continued this exploration of legacy, particularly through Nijinsky and the women that she trained. And then on the other side was a timeline. And this went from I just realized there's a slight error. 1909 all the way to 1962. So this was Ballet Russe programs right from the Diaghilev era all the way through to the subsequent companies, both of which were called Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo, confusingly at different points, and they ended in 1962. So it was sort of a visual timeline. You walked along and it was the programs from all these decades. And these all came from the University of Oklahoma, which was just fantastic. And they're all designed by incredible artists. The covers are all absolutely beautiful. So it was really wonderful to be able to kind of track that through. And here are some close-ups of the cases on the other side. Again, I really wanted to bring in ephemera and bring in pieces as not normally seen in an art gallery such as this. If you've been to the McNay, the rest of it is a much more traditional art gallery. So again, a lot of these items came from University of Oklahoma. And you can see this case focuses on the 5 Native American ballerinas who emerged in the 1940s and 50s in the US. Many of whom were trained by members of the Ballets Russes, trained by Nijinsky, worked in some of the subsequent companies. So again, this thread of legacy from these companies. And the top image looks at the first African-American ballerina, Raven Wilkinson, and also looks at the complexity of diversity in ballet even to today. So we were able to include samples of the new point shoes that are available in a diverse color range. And this has only been since 2017. And indeed only more recently with other companies that have actually offered point shoes and ballet shoes in colors other than what was called European pink. We were also donated some shoes on the side by dancers from Boston Ballet who still choose to color match their shoes themselves to their skin tone. And this case got a lot of traction, particularly from young ballet students in the area. So that was really great to see them interacting with that. And here's one of the other cases on this side, and this looks particularly at Nijinsky's legacy as a teacher. And this includes some incredible photographs of Nijinsky at Jacob's Pillow in 1941. But also in these photos are dancers who had been in the Ballets Russes, in the Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo, or were American-born dancers themselves. So again, it really encapsulated this idea of legacy and sort of following this story through. So that is all that I was going to talk you through today. I really hope you enjoyed that. And please, as I said, if you want some more information, please go and have a look at the YouTube walkthrough. Just ignore me a little bit. But yeah, thank you so much. And I think I'm going to see if I can stop sharing my screen now. And then we can, if there are any questions. All right. Oh, I think you're muted, Chloe.
Sorry, I said that to no one. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand, or just pop on and ask. I don't think we have anybody, just as long as we don't overlap too much.
I think there's a question about an exhibition catalogue. No, sadly, no catalogue, which is quite sad. I do hope we might be able to take this in some versions somewhere else, or publish some articles from it, but no catalogue. So Patsy's asked a question about how the McNay staff and the community engaged with reacted to the exhibit. They were really excited. It was really interesting. For a lot of the sort of docents and older members of the community, they knew a lot of these costumes really well and these designs. And then seeing them in a different context was really exciting. A lot of people had never seen the tent before. And this was the first time that some lone costumes had been brought in to kind of sort of bring to life some of the designs they knew. And I think just also being shown things in a different perspective. Okay, you've seen it this way, but have you looked this way? Look, this was actually made by this person, or just thinking about things in a different way. So we got some really nice responses. There's also been quite a lot of community engagement with local ballet schools and local students, music students coming in as well. So that was really nice, just to kind of open it up to a broader audience. So, any other questions?
I have a really quick question. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that these costumes are functional and that they are meant to be worn until they wear out, more or less.
Yeah.
So you were getting things ready and getting things, looking to mount stuff. Was there a lot of restoration that had to happen on any of these costumes, or were they all in like pretty good shape when they got to you?
Yes and no. So there was no budget for any conservation, anything like that. So these are as they were. So it didn't mean that a few pieces couldn't be shown because they weren't stable enough or strong enough. But at the end of the day, they're not in the best condition because they are so old, but that is, again, part of their story. So even today, dance costumes are often made to last, 10, 20 years, worn by multiple dancers. So they're really well made. And this is pre any synthetic, which is nice. So those two are the yellow and the blue costume. They're wool. And I mean, they must have been so hot to dance in. So a lot of them have lasted really well, are very well made. Ones that are made of silk, so some of the Sadko costumes have completely disintegrated. It really depended on how they were dyed at the time. But these costumes are all as they were. I believe that the King of the Sea had some conservation at some point. So some of them had already had some stabilization and things like that, but pretty much everything was just as it is. And I'm absolutely for stabilizing pieces and conserving them, but I also think you don't want to lose some of that information. You don't want to bring it back to how it looked the first day, because those repairs, those sweat stains, the makeup stains, that's all part of its story. That's what makes them such interesting pieces, primary sources. So yeah, I hope that helped.
No, it's very cool. Thank you.
Of course. So I've got a question here about how do you discover available costumes in collections? A lot of research. Many years of trying to track down where all these things are. So yeah, I have my own sort of lists. I have on my website, which I put up, there is a little guide, Ballet Russes costume guide, that I created a few years ago, which show you, where some of these holdings are. But really, it's sort of word of mouth. I have a lot of old catalogs. Not many of these are online. So, the V&A now does. and some of the other bigger collections do, but some you still have to go back to, an old catalog, or in some cases, there isn't any information at all. Or you get someone lovely like Chloe saying, we have this costume, do you know what it is? So yeah, so and we did try quite a few different places for some of the costumes, because in some cases there are multiples of things. So when we knew we wanted, costumes from Narcisse, for instance, there was a number of institutions we could approach. Obviously, some pieces are in better condition than others. Some museums or archives are more willing to loan or not, so there was that kind of thing. But yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. Oh, thank you very much. It was an absolute joy. I've been working on Ballets Russes costumes for a very long time. And this was the first time I got to bring pieces back together. I'd only ever worked on collections within an institution. So to be able to sort of reunite these pieces was really exciting. And also just to get to be with them. But yeah, I think it came together quite well. I'm sure you can all agree that, you could always write so much more. You're given this, tiny amount on a tombstone and on a panel. And I do worry that it was, a little bit surface level at some points, but I do hope it prompted people to think in a different way with some of these objects. So, and just think about who, all the work that went into it, not just composer, choreographer, designer, premiere date, who wore it, how many different people wore it, how was it altered? The yellow costume that I showed, that was shortened in the 20s so that it was more of that style, and worn by 4 or 5 different dancers. So yeah. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to do more. One of the things I would love to do is, reunite some of these sets of costumes, because again, you often see them just in isolation. And there were actually, so I think again with the yellow and blue, I think there were 6 of each of those on stage. That would just have been such a presence. So it's a dream one day that I would be able to reunite multiples of pieces to really give the impact of what it would have, or a suggestion of the impact of what it would look like on stage. Any other questions? It was also just a great opportunity to be able to research more of these pieces, and then to provide some of that research back to the learning institutions. So, for instance, the pieces that came from the McNay, they didn't know there hadn't been the research into who made those. So working with Jerry at Oklahoma, being able to give back some of that research, those sort of things were really exciting. So.
I would just like to say thank you so much for your presentation, and I would like to let everyone who's listening know that Caroline and I spent a few lovely days together going through all sorts of things in the archive, and she's just a marvelous person to work with, as well as is just very good at what she does. And Chloe, who's just disappeared again, was my graduate assistant there, and that was how this whole relationship came about. And I'm so glad that we were able to be a part of it.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, it was just a pleasure to be able to work with the collection, work with you. And I mean, I think huge thanks to you for stewarding and looking after that collection. I mean, if you guys don't know about it, please check it out. The Ballets Russes special collection is special indeed. The range of pieces that they have there is just fantastic. And we were able to show a lot of ephemera and of course the Firebird costume. So that was really exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. It's so wonderful to see you again. I was going to ask Carolyn if you could talk a little bit about some of the resources that you utilize often. So I know there are online resources and finding aids, but we've also discussed using some of the auction booklets, I suppose.
Yeah.
So are there other resources that you've found to be excessively useful?
So particularly with Ballets Russes, the auction catalogs are a great place to start if you have a costume or a design. The designs are not as pictured as much, but the auction catalogs for the costumes are a great place to start. They produce quite beautiful, elaborate, illustrated auction catalogs for them, with the costumes being worn by ballet dancers from the Royal Ballet School. But you know, and I would say though, always, you know, don't take everything you read to heart, because they catalog them quite quickly, so there are often errors, you know, about who wore what, or what a character is. There's a few great examples of costumes being worn back to front, the wrong headdress, you know, all sorts of things. So you know, sort of use that as a starting point, but not as sort of this is what they said it is. So they're a really good starting point, particularly for the costumes. And then where I was going to go with programs. So I think not just for the Ballets Russes, but for modern dance. So I do a lot of work with Jacob's Pillow as well. And the programs are a really great place to look. Also, in terms of, you get the character names, you get the dancers, sometimes you get the makers listed as well. And also you get a lot of photographs in them too. So they're a really good place to start as well. And then, yeah, the object itself, what information is in there. And I always try, it's very hard, but I always try and start when I'm working with a piece to not take on board what I've been told it is, and just to kind of see what it tells me it is. You know, what names are inside? Is there anything, you know, what decoration does it look like? So that might be getting a little bit esoteric, but you know, yeah, I would say definitely programs and auction catalogs are a really good place to start, and then you can kind of work back from there. Yeah, but I would definitely check out the Trove catalog in Australia. I use that quite a lot for this period. Any company that you're working with that toured to Australia, you might find photographs in that collection. It's really useful. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'm sure I'll think of things later. But
if anyone else has any questions, now's a great time. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up. This session was recorded, so we will put it up on the Performing Arts section, SAA Performing Arts section YouTube channel eventually. And so you can go back and watch, and you can snag any references anybody might need from Carolyn. And thank you again. This is a really oh, we have a couple more things. Looks interesting. Okay. But this is a wonderful roundabout collaboration for me that came back I don't know, 2 years later now, which is about how long it takes for everything to get going, I think, is how it works. Jerry, I'm so glad you got to come, especially because, yeah, this collection was very close to my heart. I spent a lot of time with Ballets Russes in the OU collections, and I loved that. And then also I grew up in Texas, and so the McNay was kind of a starting point for my early research career when it came to costumes and costume designs. So does anybody else have anything? I don't think so. Well, thank you so much, Carolyn. I hope you all have a wonderful Thursday. I'm trying to remember what day of the week it is. Enjoy the rest of your week.
great. Thank you all so much.